Fertility, the role of social comparisons in intensive parenting, and Michelle is going to present. Take it away.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here at the Brookings Conference. I want to talk about low fertility and the resulting policy concerns and implications. This joint work with Lucas Mahler and Min Yum, who are both here. So global fertility is at a record low, and accordingly, there's much discussion among policymakers and in the media. One concern is the sustainability of Social Security. Also, people are worried about lack of innovation if population is declining in the long run. What we want to do here in this paper today is propose a new reason for why low birth rates or why the birth rates are low, namely comparison motives. So the starting point to understand the policy implications, we need a good understanding of, a positive understanding of fertility. And so we're proposing a new channel, and then that will lead to novel policy insights. So just to put this into perspective, this is the recent fertility decline in the United States. So over the last quarter century, fertility fell actually quite a bit in the United States. At the same time, I want to stress that this is not true universally across countries. So this is all the high-income countries. We put them into 4 categories based on their shape. And so the United States is declining, that's the blue line. And so there are other countries like Korea, Singapore, Chile, who have been also declining a lot, and they've been in the media a lot. But there are many other examples. So my home country, Germany, for example, over the same time period has actually been on the rise. And other countries like the UK, Canada, and New Zealand, over the same 25 years, there has been sort of like a mini baby boom. And then there are a bunch of countries who are sort of flat. So a very heterogeneous path among high-income countries. So as I said, we want to propose here a novel explanation for low fertility rates, and that is related to the so-called social comparison motives. The idea dates back to Veblen, saying that people care about relative status, right? This is an idea from more than 100 years ago. In fact, there's a large macro literature that sort of embeds this idea, the whole literature on catching up with the Jonases. So we believe that these relative status concerns are also very relevant when it comes to children. So that parents care about the educational outcomes and the quality of their children relative to those of other parents' children. And that idea then tilts the quantity-quality trade-off towards quality. That in turn makes children expensive, and that then depresses the birth rate. That, in a nutshell, is the idea. So in this remaining 12 minutes here, I want to formalize the idea, show you some suggestive evidence on the relevance of this idea in the data, and then talk about the policy implications. So to formalize the idea, here's a simple model. Suppose parents choose fertility N, and also how much time to invest in each child, X. So the comparison motive comes in with the idea that parents care about child human capital H relative to some benchmark level H tilde, right? So they care, look at the utility function about own consumption, child, and number of children, and also H, human capital, but relative to that benchmark. And then the benchmark itself is determined in equilibrium by the choices of the other parents in the economy. The chi is an important parameter here. The chi determines the strength of the comparison motive. So if chi is 0, then there is no comparison motive, right? And now we want to explore the idea, suppose countries differ by chi. So it's a cultural parameter, and countries somehow have different comparison motives, or different regions could also have different comparison motives. So the model results are then, just to be very clear, what does the model imply? Result number 1, countries or counties or regions with a stronger comparison motive invest more in education and accordingly have lower fertility rates. Then we extend the model. I won't have time to go through all of that, but so basically we add heterogeneity, so we can think about rich and poor parents. We add parental monetary investments, which might be quite important in some parts of the world. We want to add upward comparison motives, so maybe people are looking up to the educational outcomes of sort of the top part of the distribution. We also consider productivity and accordingly income changes over time. And that then leads to result number 2. If Z, so productivity, or accordingly income, grows over time, then fertility falls. That's not very surprising or novel, but the novel part is that the fall is larger the stronger the comparison motive. So fertility declines are basically amplified by the comparison motive. And result 3 is spillovers. So basically the idea that with an upward comparison motive, fertility declines even for groups that experience no income growth. Because the benchmark is moving by what the higher income people are doing, they're trying to keep up, and then that depresses their birth rate as well. So now I want to show empirical evidence on this. And so in previous work, we've investigated actually this idea specifically for South Korea, and now I want to convince you this is also very relevant in other parts of the world. So let me start with some cross-country evidence. So the model predicts a negative relationship between the comparison motives and fertility. So now we need a proxy for comparison motives. So the first proxy here we're using is education worry. So questions from the World Values Surveys asking parents, how worried are you about your not being able to provide enough education for your children? And so in a cross-section of countries here, we find that these education worries are very negatively related with fertility. So the most worried countries are precisely Korea, Singapore, Japan, and the fertility rate there is about 0.2 children lower compared to countries like Germany or the Czech Republic, where they're not so worried. The second result I mentioned was that the model predicts a larger fertility decline over time, precisely in those countries that have a stronger comparison motive. Again, here proxied with these education worries. And so what we find here in a cross-country regression, and I should mention that there are a bunch of controls in here as well, but we find this negative relationship. So the decline over time in the fertility rate was most pronounced in the countries that had this larger education worries. And that brings me back to that opening picture of the very different cross-country experiences over time. It's precisely South Korea, Singapore, and Chile that in our data have the strongest comparison motives, and those are also the countries that are big time declining over this time period. Germany, again, to give a different example, doesn't have these strong education worries, and in fact, fertility has been slightly increasing over this time period. So, what about other kinds of evidence? That was cross-country. So let's think about the US specifically. And here we're using evidence across US counties. So maybe even better proxy of these comparison motives. Comparisons often happen these days through social media. So we're using an index created by Rush Chetty and co-authors called they call it economic connectedness. But what it is among low socioeconomic status individuals, how many Facebook friends do they have as a share of their friends that are from a higher socioeconomic status? And with the idea of if you have a lot of friends from a higher socioeconomic status, you're looking up to them, right? So it's, I think, a pretty good proxy of this idea of the upward comparison motives. And what we find is that the counties where this that have a lot of economic connectedness, a high value of this index, their birth rate is particularly low. These are births per 1,000 childbearing age women. And so it's actually quite sizable. If you go from the left to the right, we're talking about a difference of birth rates of about 20 out of an average of 50. So what are the deeper reasons why do we have this comparison motives? We can speculate it can be cultural, so I haven't said much about that. But one hypothesis is it's driven by the college education system, by the admissions to college, the competitiveness for college slots. So then the model would predict that states that have more competition for college slots should also have fewer births. And so this relates to an idea back in a Brookings paper from 15 years ago by Valerie Ramey, where she was arguing it's the competition for college slots that drives this excessive parental investment. We're basically taking that same idea a step further and saying, well, then these excessive parental investments are very time-intensive, costly for the parents, then also means the parent choosing fewer children. And in fact, that is what we find. So we use that same index from the original Ramey paper. It's from a paper actually by John Bound, a competitiveness index of colleges, and we find it's negatively related with the birth rate. So So I have 5 minutes now to talk about policy. So first point to make here is that there was a switch in the policy stance over time. So for most of the 20th century, in fact, most countries, or many countries, were worried about birth control, and they're worried about overpopulation. They were trying to curb people's fertility. So think about, the one-child policy in China, but also in many other countries. There were all sorts of birth control policies implemented. By now, more than 30% of the countries try to encourage birth, so there was a strong shift. So the obvious question to ask is should governments actually try to interfere at all? Should they try to curb or stimulate fertility? So what are the frictions? What are the market failures? So we think to answer this question, we need to understand the reasons behind the low fertility rates, to know what's going on or what's going wrong and whether we should intervene and how. So we want to argue here in this paper that the comparison motive justifies government intervention in the following sense. So the comparison motive poses an externality, and that externality leads to inefficiently high education investment and accordingly an inefficiently low birth rate or fertility rate. We show in the model, theoretically, that the first best can be implemented by a combination of pronatal transfers, but the transfers financed through a tax on education, precisely to try to curb the education investments. Now, as economists, maybe we're worried, wait a second, doesn't that mean human capital will go down? And that's kind of weird, because usually we all try to encourage human capital investments. So, will reducing parental investment be bad for the kids? Well, I want to argue not necessarily. Some of these educational investments are at least arguably socially wasteful. So think about all these SAT prep courses that help your kids be better test takers, but probably, or faster test takers, but probably not raise their human capital. Or you hire a tutor to write the essay for you to get into college, the kid is not going to be a better essay writer in the end. So that's arguably socially wasteful. On top of it, some of these investments may even be socially harmful. So think about excessive study time. So it's not just money, right? The kids also have to spend the time studying. That means they spend a lot of time indoors, and time indoors has been connected to rises in myopia rates, for example. Also, arguably, obesity, right? If the kids are not running around anymore, they're just studying all the time. And, child mental health has been deteriorating in recent years. So, there could be a connection on that as well, potentially. So to make that point, we also include in the paper a model of college admissions where banning test preparation is welfare improving and does not lower child human capital, just to really make that point. So what are the novel policy implications that follow then from this? Well, in the model, it's we should tax or potentially regulate private education institutions. So again, maybe you think that's a bit far-fetched, but there are actually examples from other countries. So China quite recently banned private for-profit after-school tutoring. Similarly, Korea has all these hagwons, which are private after-school tutoring institutes, and they didn't ban them completely, but they introduced a bunch of curfews so that they cannot open until midnight, so that the kids cannot study like super late. In the UK, they recently abandoned the VAT tax exemption of private schools, so very recently, just this year. So there are many examples. Interestingly, in the United States, the recent changes in the 529 plans actually went in the opposite direction, right? Creating more tax exemptions for all sort of private education activities, like SAT prep courses, for example. Another policy angle could be to think about weakening people's ability to act on the comparison motive. So, in some countries have very high stakes exams, so maybe that system could be changed. It's very national test taking. Also, communication about precise rank information, maybe we should think about that with more caution. And Korea recently acted on that. So they tried to replace an exact score for a college entry exam with a 5-tier system. So that if you're somewhere in the middle of, then there's no point in investing so much more because you're in the middle of some category. Also, maybe community should be a little bit more careful when publishing school rankings. So this is competition on a different level, right? But like, if you don't even know which school is just an epsilon better, then you're not putting so much effort in trying to get to this epsilon better school. Another angle could be social media regulations. So I think in terms of these comparison motives, the role of momfluencers and mommy blogs probably played quite a role. And maybe, I don't know exactly how to regulate that, but it's a very different angle from the usual fertility policies. So at least something to think about. So let me summarize. I am out of time, but the comparison motive is a novel reason for low fertility. We think it's an important reason. We provided some suggestive evidence here that comparison motive and birth rates are negatively related, and also that fertility declines are more pronounced in countries with a strong comparison motive, and that this leads, and we argue then that this leads to novel policy implications. Thank you very much.
And our first discussant is Melissa Kearney.
Great, thank you. Okay, so thanks to the organizers for the invitation to discuss this really interesting paper. I want to start by putting this new idea and this paper in the context of where I see the literature and current thinking on this. And I think what the author's done is really valuable in the sense that they're pushing the literature and the policy conversation in a new direction. So I want to emphasize that up front. I think that's a really valuable contribution. And so what I've done here is just pulled out the way the authors situate this paper and this idea. And they point out, rightly in my view, that there's a very large literature, 60 years of literature in economics about fertility, the demand for children, and that really dates back to Becker's novel, and Becker's model. And in that model, it's just a constrained optimization function where children are normal goods, and there's lots of empirical evidence that it looks like children are normal goods, and people are making a decision about how many kids to have subject to a budget constraint. And the key insights that come out of that standard workhorse Becker model are that opportunity costs really matter, and parents are making decisions trading off quality and quantity. But what the authors also rightly point out, in my view, is that what people who have been working in this field have come to increasingly appreciate over the past few years is that our focus on that very simple sort of standard constrained optimization problem, looking at the types of prices and costs that we typically look at, is really not getting us very far, if anywhere, in explaining the dramatic recent decline in fertility, especially in the high-income world. And so the authors point to a new set of papers or ideas that are pushing things like career concerns, family policies, social norms, and shifting priorities. Okay, so I'm going to push on this. Again, I think it's really productive to move our focus as economists away from these standard explanations. And all I'm doing here, mostly for the benefit of people in the room who don't work on this area, why are so many of us trying to look for new and novel explanations? Here, what I'm showing you is just 3 figures from a 2020 paper that Luke Perdue, Phil Levine, and I have in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, showing that if we look at the sort of standard things, and I'm just pulling out here childcare costs, the female-male wage ratio, student debt, because that's something people talk a lot about in the policy conversation. Those things might matter on the margin for some people, but they really have no explanatory power in the patterns. So if you look at the top graph, places in the US that experienced higher increases in childcare costs, they did not have larger declines in fertility. That line is not sloping down, okay? Same with the female-male wage ratio, et cetera. Okay, so this is really useful. Let's think in a new direction, and what they do in this paper is highlight the role of intensive parenting, which in their formulation comes from comparison motives. Okay, I want to put this in a broader context. My view on this is that social comparisons and intensive parenting are potentially contributing factors, but they don't sit outside career concerns and some of those other forces. I see all of these things as working together. And that's a little bit of a different framework than trying to line up a bunch of different factors and say which looks like it's doing more. So this is something that Phil and I wrote, and we put this out as an NBR working paper this summer. We're revising it for David for the JEL. Our read of the evidence is that what we're seeing across mostly high and middle income countries is a broad reordering of adult priorities, with parenthood occupying a diminished role. And the term we came up with, maybe it's not great, but we refer to this as shifting priorities and propose that it likely reflects a complex mix of changing norms, evolving economic opportunities and constraints, and broader social and cultural forces. So let me put parenting, and eventually I'll get to comparison motives, in this framework. Okay, so the way I think we should be thinking about this, let's still think about this like economists. It's a lifetime constrained optimization problem. But what we have is, in the green, we've got a bunch of norms. We have norms about gender roles and expectations, about leisure norms, right? What do we want to do in our free time? Parenting norms, how intense is parenting? And also work norms, that's where we could think about greedy jobs. If we've got greedy jobs and we've got greedy parenting, so parenting is intense, all of that affects both the utility of having kids. If leisure norms have also changed, that also affects just what's in the choice set. So when people are making choices, they're hitting their 20s and they're making choices, how much do I want to prioritize kids and marriage and career and leisure? The norms in these different areas all matter. Okay, where do those norms come from? Well, some of it comes from economic opportunities and constraints. Some of it comes from cultural forces like media and religion. These things are affecting both the utility function, the choice set, and the constraints that people are operating under. And what we get is the way people are prioritizing spending their 20s and 30s investing in marriage, having kids, career, or pursuing leisure goals. All right, so what about comparative motives? In the paper, the way the authors describe this is actually back to the pretty standard Becker framework, where they say there's comparison motives. That leads to intensive parenting, in particular in the realm of education, that raises the cost of kids, and so that tilts us towards quality over quantity and leads to fewer kids. If we instead think of comparison motives, in part, as the author said, coming from opportunity, economic opportunities and pressures, it could be one of the key drivers of parenting norms, in particular intensive parenting. Okay? Now, as I've mentioned, the intensive parenting sort of reduces the utility of having kids. It's less fun to have kids, maybe, if you can't just let them play in the neighborhood, but you got to drive them all over the place and do all this stuff with them, right? But it also increases the opportunity costs. It comes up against any goals you might have for some leisure time or career. And so that shifts the priority ranking away from parenthood in a way that doesn't just lead to fewer kids, but also more childlessness. So I'm not disagreeing with the authors. I'm just putting this idea that comparison motives drive intense parenting norms in a different lens or perspective. Okay, the authors, I think, do a very nice job building descriptive evidence for this idea that places that have greater competitive pressures, I just pulled out one of their proxies, they have a bunch, birth rates are lower in those places, and birth rates have fallen by more. Okay, I think they make a nice descriptive case. What I want to suggest, though, is that maybe it's not about the comparison motive per se, but it's about parenting intensity. So what I've pulled here is this is data from the US American Time Use Survey. These more competitive places, you also see parents spending more time in childcare activities. And it's not just in education, it's also in travel, it's in recreation. As I was sitting at my daughter's hockey practice reading this paper, I thought of Valerie Ramey standing here 15 years ago presenting about how, she was driving her daughter all over to, I think it was horse shows, but somebody might remember better than me. But anyway, basically, in South Korea, they might be taking their kids to tutoring. In the US, we're just spending a lot more time with kids, especially in these more competitive places. Okay, and places where parents have are spending more time with their kids, we do see fertility rates falling by more. Okay, even more relevant than just thinking about the past 20 years, think about what's happened over cohorts. So here I'm pulling from Susan Bianchi's work. Over time, what do we see? We see that women have been spending more time in paid work, more time in childcare, more time in leisure. So I submit that the girls growing up in the late 80s and 90s, they saw their moms much more harried than those of us who grew up in the 70s or early 80s. That affects what they think they want to do in their 20s and 30s. All right, we see this across other countries. This is, from The Economist, pulling on an academic paper. Across countries, people over the past 4 decades, they're just spending more time with their kids. What it means to be a parent is different now than it was in the 70s. So now let's look at cohort fertility. And this is, again, from the paper we're writing for David for the JEL. If you look at the US, you look at women who were born in the mid-70s through the women born in the 90s, their fertility is declining across the life cycle. Now, of course, they're not done having kids, so maybe they're going to catch up. But right now, it looks like across the life cycle, fertility is declining. And we see that in other high-income countries as well. Here's what's really important. This is driven by an increase in childlessness. More people are remaining childless across the life cycle. So again, women who were born in the mid-90s, they're not done with their childbearing years, but 50% of 30-year-old women in the US now are childless. It is unlikely that that's going to converge down to 10% of the previous cohorts. And again, we see this increase in childlessness in other countries as well. All right, to me, this is potentially suggestive of a lifestyle reaction, okay? So what do I mean? People are more likely to be prioritizing things other than having kids in their 20s and 30s, or they're more likely to be choosing or winding up with a child-free lifestyle. To be clear, this could be driven either by preferences or constraints, right? This is just a different interpretation of how intensive parenting is affecting the fertility choice. In this perspective on things, it's less about a quality-quantity trade-off. I'm having fewer kids because I really want to make sure that they get to a good college. And more, let me quote one of my younger, recently married friends, when I said, do you think you're going to have kids? And I'm like an old lady. And she's like, Melissa, you were just running around all the time. I have no interest in spending my weekends at youth soccer tournaments. And sure enough, this week she's posting on Instagram and she's hanging out in the French Polynesia. And am I not spending the next 2 weekends at a youth hockey tournament and at a youth soccer tournament? That's not about wanting to invest in kids as much as parenting is really intense. There are other things that I want to do that might not have been so readily available to parents or women in the past. And so people are sort of, choosing when you have this conflict between intensive parenting and career or leisure goals, there's just a shifting of how many people are not having kids or not prioritizing having kids in their 20s and 30s, which, because of the uncertainty and the biological restrictions, actually winds up with increased childlessness. Okay. My final minute on the welfare implications and policy in this paper. I completely agree with the authors that the current low fertility equilibrium might be suboptimal. And I want to be very precise here. In the way the authors talk about it, it's suboptimal from the perspective of individual welfare. This isn't even about the fact that we might be concerned about the externalities of having, fewer kids in a declining population. This does not get nearly enough attention in the public discourse on this. The public discourse on this, as soon as you bring up, hey, people aren't having kids, there's a huge backlash. Don't tell women to have kids. And what the authors are saying, and I want to emphasize, is that maybe people would be happier if we weren't in this equilibrium with really intense parenting where people are feeling like, their choices aren't available and so they're having fewer kids. Everybody might be happier if parents just chilled out and people could have more kids, and it was less likely to impose such severe opportunity costs on their career or leisure or other goals. Okay, so the survey data, in fact, from across countries shows that people's ideal fertility size, ideal family size, their desired fertility, is higher than realized. So this is another really nice feature of this paper. It's to shed light on this fact that people might be having fewer children than they themselves would want to have if constraints were different or parenting wasn't so intense. Okay, so to wrap it up, I think this is a super interesting paper, and it pushes the literature away from standard explanations in a way that I think is super valuable and thought-provoking.
And our second discussion is David Weil.
Okay, well, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to discuss this really fascinating paper on an important issue. The motivation's pretty clear. Fertility's fallen everywhere in the world. The United States is late to the game. Maybe a little shamefully, the economics profession in the United States is a little late to the game because like it wasn't our thing, but now it's our thing, and so we're joining. There's a lot of heterogeneity among rich countries, which is a lot to explore. This paper is all about the drivers of fertility decline. There's a whole separate literature on the economic effects of that. Just as an advertisement, I have a paper I'm writing for the Journal of Economic Perspectives on that topic. So what do we agree on? Well, first we agree that for rich modern countries, there is nothing that pins fertility down near the replacement level. I've sort of been on endless discussions where people say, well, isn't it unnatural that fertility is below the replacement rate? And I say, no. Here's my friend Malthus. Malthus explained why fertility should be at the replacement rate in the equilibrium that held in the world until about 1800 or something in Europe. We're not in that equilibrium anymore, so we shouldn't be shocked or surprised at sub-replacement fertility, but it's still very interesting. And so we want to study the decline over time and the heterogeneity across countries. And second thing I think Michelle and Melissa and all of us agree on is this is very complicated. There are a lot of factors that drive fertility, and we're not going to have a smoking gun. This paper is looking at one particular factor and kind of bringing this into the discussion, which I think is fine. So kind of to set things up, here's just kind of a general list of things that affect fertility. So there's a whole lot of literature on the degree to which child rearing is shared between men and women. There's literature on the size of the penalty that people pay, particularly mothers, when they exit the labor force to care for kids. There's literature on the monetary and time costs of children, the availability and effectiveness of contraception, and all sorts of cultural factors that affect fertility. So these things differ across countries. This paper is going to zoom in on this box of the monetary and time costs of children, and within that there's kind of a lot of things to talk about. So some of it is sort of the standard inputs to child rearing. So for example, children are very space intensive. If the price of housing goes up, that's going to drive down fertility. That's one reason that we see low fertility in cities where housing is particularly expensive. Then there are some fixed costs that I would say are unrelated to child quality. So if you don't know it, this Nickerson and Solomon paper with the great title, Are Car Seats a Form of Contraception? Is about how we've changed the car seat standards. So kids have to stay in car seats longer, and you can't fit 3 car seats in the back of a sedan. And so that means for many, many families, having a third child is a huge economic burden, and they show that it reduces fertility. And then finally, there's desired child quality. So we may actually want to put more investments into these children. We can open up that box. And again, there's kind of various things to talk about. So there's this great work by Depke and Zilabati, which is about people investing more in child welfare, not because of these comparison motives, but for a more instrumental reason, that the return to where your child is in the quality distribution in their generation has increased as inequality has risen. And so even if you just care about your child's welfare, not comparatively, you're induced to invest more in your child's human capital. But then secondly, there's this whole set of social comparison motives, and that's what this paper is going to focus on. So Michelle kind of took you through this already, but here's kind of the maximization problem that the household faces. So they want to do some consumption. They get utility from that. They get utility from the number of children, and they get utility from per child human capital. They've got a very standard budget constraint where that lambda is the per child costs not related to quality, so that's things like the car seats. But then there's some cost of child quality, that's the investment X per child. And then added to that, there's this comparison piece. So chi is kind of the strength of the comparison motive, and H tilde, that's the average level of human capital, or in some cases, it's also sort of the human capital of the elite that you're looking up to. But that thing chi times H tilde is kind of being taken out of your utility because of this comparison motive. And so if you increase the strength of that thing, if you raise chi times H tilde, that's going to lower parental utility directly. It's a negative externality. It's going to shift the decision of parents. They're going to invest more in the human capital of each child, and they're going to have fewer children. So the story in the paper, as I said, benchmark H tilde is either the average human capital or the elite human capital or something like that. The story in the paper is that chi has gotten bigger over time because of social media. So we all know what everyone else is doing. And that's leading to these kind of rat race expenditures in which, I have to invest more because my kids' peers' parents are investing more in their kids. And that's making us all unhappy and lowering fertility. And of course, on net, we can't change the comparison, so it's wasteful. So that's sort of the standard mechanism. And then that mechanism can also amplify other shocks. So if there's some change in the value of child human capital or in the weight in utility, that's going to be amplified through this pernicious mechanism. Okay? If you didn't believe this kind of stuff was happening, here's a page from TikTok. And this is a page of instructions on how to make Instagram posts about your college decision. So not only do you have to sort of share your quality of your college decision, but you have to do it in a high-quality post. And evidently, this stuff is ubiquitous. OK, so as Michelle said, we've been down this road a little before. So Veblen was here. If you read the theory of the leisure class, there's this key idea of the invidious comparison. So an invidious comparison is that what I care about is how I rank relative to someone else. That's the thing that gives me respect and worth. It confers status and honor. So kind of the classic example we all know is conspicuous consumption. So you have expensive watches and stuff like that. So you can show everyone that your watch is better than them. And you're signaling your wealth and sort of showing that you have more wealth than them. I won't have time to go into it, but interestingly, Veblen, what we call leisure in our economic models, that is time away from doing hard stuff, is what he calls indolence. Conspicuous leisure is a different thing. Conspicuous leisure is knowing the forms of domestic music and dogs and sports and fancy breeds of animals and stuff like that. That's all to show that in the time that I didn't see you, I was not being indolent. I was not working. I was actually studying up on dogs and stuff like that. And from that, you know that I don't have to work and I'm wealthy. So it's all about signaling status and wealth through these kind of what seemed to Veblen and what seemed to me like kind of pointless activities. So where does this paper sit relative to Veblen? So in Veblen, it's really all about wealth, and wealth is the thing that matters in the end. This paper, kind of in the modern fashion, thank you, produces puts that into the utility function directly as a primitive. I think Veblen would say that's not right. Veblen sort of cites all these examples of people thinking they care about, say, women having super small waists, which shows that they can't work and stuff like that. People think they care about that, but Veblen says they don't really care about that. They really care about the status that it's signaling. So for a while, I was on board with that. Then I introspected a little more. I'll show you some of my other introspection later. But the other thing I introspected about was I've written models with habit formation in them. And in a habit formation model, formally it looks exactly like we were just looking at. There's a thing that gets subtracted from your utility, which in that case is your own past consumption. So if I have a certain level of consumption now, I'm made less happy if I had high consumption in the past. I believe in that, and that's not about status. So that actually made me think more that the utility function approach was correct. OK, so I believe the approach. I kind of believe this with respect to child quality, but I have a lot of questions. So one kind of obvious one is, why doesn't the number of children fit into this as well? And I think, again, introspecting and doing amateur sociology, I think there is some of that. I think that in some cases, people sort of are proud of showing off the number of their children. It shows kind of economically I can do this, and my wife and I can both work and be very accomplished, but we also have these children, so like we're cooler than you are. And of course, that kind of comparison would raise fertility in an obvious way. And then secondarily, there are a lot of other things that might lower fertility that are not about comparing child quality. So I'll go straight to my picture. So you can post on Instagram about all the cool vacations you've been on. And that's a form of comparison utility. The people on the right there made an Instagram post about their new car so that other people can feel bad about not having a new car. That's a gender reveal party. I missed those, thank God. That's a hike that I went on. And then this is the other introspecting I did. This is not mine and not anyone in this room's Google Scholar profile. And again, I'm sort of on the author's side here. Like, I care a lot about how my citations compare to other people, and that's not a signal of wealth. Like, I could show you my bank account, but I do care about these things. So they do enter my utility function. But of course, all of these things are going to go the other way. So we could put chi terms in for all of these things for social comparisons, and that's going to lower fertility by a different channel. So I think it's a similar story, but it's sort of not through the child quality channel. Okay, what are the policy implications? Well, the paper says it's a negative externality. We should have a Pigouvian tax. That's pretty obvious. If you wanted to extend things, you could say, well, we should have Pigouvian taxes on all these other things. Like if you're going to post on Instagram your new car or something like that, you should pay a Pigouvian tax. Or we should just tax fancy cars or things like that. All the things that I think don't contribute directly to utility but are only status goods should be taxed, but I don't know how we define those. Another policy which I find intriguing is we could just add some randomness to the college admissions process. I think that would be good. Michelle kind of mentioned this point, that I'm a little reluctant to say we should start taxing education because I do a lot of growth models, and growth models, education has a positive externality, and so we're supposed to subsidize it, not taxed. I think it's a very interesting question of like what they do in these Korean cram schools and in the Russian math and in stuff like that. Is that all just kind of wasteful comparisons? I see a lot of kids come to college with that kind of training, and actually they're really smart and well trained, and I think they do good stuff. So I'm a little wary of taxing that. Okay, I have a further worry that yes, social media has raised the degree of comparison, and that's a bad thing, and maybe we should just tax status comparisons. But at least in the education realm, part of the increased competition is because we have moved to a more mobile and fluid society. So the Ivy League used to be full of the children of rich people who lived in the neighborhood, and over the course of 2 generations, it has become far more meritocratic and allowed, Vietnamese kids from Queens who study really hard to get into an Ivy League school and accomplish a lot. And I think that's good. So that is kind of the flip side of this comparison. So in conclusion, I think that this model of hyper-competitive investment in children is clearly part of the story, and it's most applicable, as we all know, in Korea and other places in East Asia where there's this great competition for university admissions. It's not the whole story. I just gave the example of Canada here. Canada has notably sort of flat college admissions. So people stay regionally. They're not sorted severely like they are in the United States. But fertility is still quite low there. I won't show you the slide, but of course the post-2008 decline in US fertility was the same for people with mothers with 4-year colleges and mothers without. Presumably the 4-year college ones are more in this competitive college world. So it was never supposed to be an explanation for everything, so I don't really consider that a failure of the paper, but I am with the authors that I think that this kind of comparison of status thing is definitely part of the story. Thanks.
All right, Steve.
Thanks. Super interesting paper and discussion about what really is a first-order issue. I want to express a few doubts about the particular mechanism emphasized in this paper, but also add some reasons why, more generally, we might think horizontal effects on fertility are important. So I think invidious social comparisons around educational attainment may be a prominent feature of life in the social and professional circles that we travel in. But I question whether that's true for the U.S. as a whole. Basic skills mastery, reading, writing, arithmetic, and so on, are not particularly impressive across much of the U.S. distribution. And my understanding is they've been declining since at least 2013 by these various efforts to make comprehensive assessments and cross-country comparisons. And if people really were focused on educational attainment and getting into the right college, I'd expect to see overwhelming political pressures to improve our public schools, which are abysmal in many parts of the country. There are pressures like that. They're hardly overwhelming. So those are some reasons why I don't think the particular emphasis on the educational motive is compelling in the U.S. context. But beyond the instrumental motives that David mentioned, and some of what Melissa mentioned, I just want to point out there are other horizontal effects at work. So I think about my own personal history. So I'm one of 5 children. I grew up in a Catholic family in an environment in which 5 was not a particularly eyebrow-raising number. The median was probably 4. It affected how all kinds of activities got organized. Families got together, and 3 or 4 or 5 families got together. The parents were all in one section of the house or the yard. The kids were all somewhere else. Mothers, typically, not usually fathers, would take 30-minute shifts to watch the kids and make sure they didn't kill each other. And life was basically organized around that. You could do all your things. If you have 5 kids today, either nobody invites you to the entertainment activities because they are afraid you will come, or you look at what the accommodations are like and you realize this is not for you. So I could go on in this vein, but there really are potentially powerful horizontal effects that can operate through other mechanisms, and I'm quite open to the possibility that they are important. I also want to reiterate the childlessness point that Melissa made. That just doesn't, that resonates, that says to me there are other things that are pushing people away from higher fertility beyond what's emphasized in this paper. And then I just, like this idea of taxing education and people's efforts to improve the human capital of their kids, I view this as dangerous and nutty. And let's take the South Korean example, where there may be socially excessive forms of education in some respects. But if you look at the broad sweep, South Korea is one of the most successful economic and even political development stories in all of human history. You think that China had a great growth miracle. It's nothing compared to what happened in South Korea since where they came from, the 1950s. So if they've got some social pressures towards high education, that seems to be, I would think, is a big part of their success story. And I certainly wouldn't want to kill that golden goose.
Ben?
Thanks. So 3 quick things. So Melissa said something which I think is really interesting, and I want to understand more. She said maybe it's not about the comparison motive, but the increase in parenting intensity. So why has parenting become so much more intense? Is it that there's this comparison motive, or is it that we have higher utility? We just like hanging out with our kids more. I really don't understand that, and that seems pretty central to understanding at least some of the potential interventions. Secondly, on the comparison motive in social media, on my Facebook page, it is considered taboo to post your kid's GPA, to post your kid's educational attainment. No one would ever say my kid's in AP, whatever. It's not taboo to talk about athletics. So I think athletics are a really important part of this. It's completely fine to brag about your child and athletics. So there's certain things you can brag about and certain things you can't. We saw that with David's example up there. Secondly, thinking about social media, the price is not really salient here, right? Like, I don't post at 2 a.m. when my daughter's throwing up and isn't this hard? I post all the wins. Like, I would think that social media was actually encouraging people to have more kids. Parenting looks really fun on social media. And and also around the timing of it, where I make a decision whether to have a child or not, and then I don't really observe the cost in terms of the parenting competitiveness until much later. So I have 3 teenage daughters. I am living this, but it didn't really start until 9 or 10, when things got really intense and really competitive. The last thing I'll say, just going back to the point about athletics, is that at least in the social circles that I'm a part of, the capital that goes into athletics dwarfs that goes into education, which is insane. If you want to talk about wasted social capital, I mean, this is number one. The majority of my daughter's teammates have their own coach on their soccer teams. And so if you're thinking about things which are not particularly controversial, I agree with Steve. I really get worried about taxing education in any way, shape, or form. But you can tax athletics in ways which I think would probably be more acceptable to U.S. policymakers.
Elaine?
So I think that your explanation of college competitiveness is really interesting, but I want to raise some things that you may not have yet tried to test that. One is that, of course, there's still a large proportion of American high school graduates who don't go to college. So how could you control across geography? But the fertility decline seems to be across income groups and therefore education groups. So how could you control for that? And then one thing that's really changed over time is the cost of public education, partly because the tax dollars used to support it versus what comes out of tuition has evolved. So can you test for that as a contributor? It's also, it becomes more expensive. Another change is the share of places at state universities that go to either out-of-state students or foreign students. So could you test for something like the share of places going to in-state students at the flagship university in a state? And you probably have some interesting natural experiment on foreign students, or at least Chinese students, starting around 2000. And last, religion's attitude to birth control, most visibly the Catholic churches, have evolved over time. So is that a consideration? And can you check by state with different percentages of the population in different religions?
Okay, we have a question from Valerie Ramey over Zoom. Valerie?
Thank you. This was a really interesting session, both the paper and the discussants. I just wanted to make two comments. First of all, I think thinking about the role of getting into higher education, the tournament motive is so important. And that's why Gary and I titled our paper The Rugrat Race, because there is the idea of the tournament motive. And so some of the investment could be wasteful. I want to echo Steve Davis's point that regulating test scores or any kinds of things like that is a bad idea. I can tell you what happened at the University of California when they got rid of standardized tests. But however, the issue is that the top places are not expanding their slots relative to the lower places. So if you wanted any kind of subsidy, that might be the first place to look. Second, I wanted to suggest that maybe these fertility trends won't necessarily keep going on. And I think that there's a possibility for longer run cycles. And that's because they're learning from older cohorts. There's a wonderful paper by Raquel Fernandez in the AER in 2013 that talked about how women learn by observing older cohorts that you could have a career and children, and that's what led to increased labor force participation. But then, of course, subsequently, women climbed the career ladder, and I wanted to pick up on Melissa Carney's point, is that the current generation of women in their 20s and 30s observed how harried their mothers, my generation, were, and their fathers, because they were trying to do high-powered careers and children. And so that could be part of this decline of fertility, particularly the ones who decide to remain childless. However, as they get older, they're going to start observing that there are a lot of lonely, childless widows and widowers who don't have anybody to take care of them, who don't have anybody to make sure they're not scammed out of their life saving. And that could actually lead to, and they have no nieces and nephews because their siblings didn't have any children. And that could lead people to put more weight on having children.
Dimitris.
Co-authors. Sorry. So on the point about social comparisons, there's a beautiful paper by DiMarzo, Ilan Kramer, and Ron Keneal that show that how competition for scarce resources can end up looking a lot like catching up with the Jonases, where the wealth of other people shows up in your value function. So the behavior may be different, but then be the same, but the welfare, or the prescriptions are very different. So rather than taxing the Veblen goods, what you want to do is alleviate scarcity. So figure out what exactly is it, this scarce resource that people are competing for, and slots in education is clearly a first order thing, and maybe trying to alleviate that.
Catherine?
Super interesting paper. On this idea of the shifting priorities that Melissa brought up versus the comparison motive, to me it seems like they would have different implications for assortative matching, right? If it's just about shifting priorities, you want the guy who wants to go to French Polynesia with you, but if it's comparison motives, you're going to look for the person that went to the good school or, whatever, has good genes. So sorry to be the non-romantic, but it would be interesting to think about the implications this has for matching.
Larry?
So, super interesting paper. One thought that came to my mind that wasn't on that list at all, but feels salient. I grew up in California, and something you see there is that costs have gotten so high that lots of people have their children, their adult children, who are coming and living with them for maybe even up to a decade after they graduate, et cetera. And it feels like there's a whole distribution of outcomes that your children face. There's a lot of uncertainty in life. And so imagine you live in a world in which kind of there's a lottery. It's not just your initial human capital, but there's a lot of randomness in what will happen after those initial investments are made. And in that world, risk-type considerations seem like, if I have any sort of curvature over that, those would affect my incentives in a very similar way. But again, I feel like the policy, one simple way is if it's just that coefficient itself is larger in some places relative to others. So being the best has higher returns in some labor markets like near Silicon Valley relative to others. Then in that world, kind of second moment effects, this is going to basically shift the variance term, and that's going to make people more risk averse and therefore, kind of behave in a similar way. And so just kind of, again, I feel like the policy prescriptions there are totally different. It's about the safety net, making sure that your kids can be okay. It's about the scarcity of educational opportunities, et cetera. So just curious your thoughts on the kind of second moment effects. Thanks.
Justin?
Just while we're talking about social comparisons, I want to let Steve Davis know I was one of 6 kids. So after a day and a half, I'm glad that Brookings has finally moved to a macro paper. And I mean macro because macro is about big questions, and I thought about what's big, and this is just a note of encouragement to my friends over there in the corner. I was thinking about what would happen if someone took one of my kids hostage, and my willingness to pay would be easily 7 figures. And I have 2 of those, so therefore my willingness to pay is enormous. And so to everyone else who's on the program who's been looking at policies that have an impact of less than $1 million per capita, stop looking at the small stuff and start looking at the big issues. So I think this stuff really matters. One thing that's been notably missing is dads. So I arrived here and I sat next to George Akerlof. George asked me about my kid and I told him. And then I asked George about his kid, and his kid has 1 more QJE paper than my kid. And his kid has tenure. And so maybe that social interaction is something that wouldn't have happened 50 years ago. George and I are both deeply involved dads. And 50 years ago, economists were not deeply involved dads, which means now an average household has twice as many people to do social comparisons, which sort of gives Michelle's force, so rather than looking to Instagram, maybe we should look at dads, because dads care about kids now. I'm talking with my therapist about my dad a lot, so... On this idea of whether or not we should be taxing education, I've got a much better idea. Just choose unsuccessful friends. And then everyone feels better. And so actually, I think you get a direct policy implication here, which is we don't want to tax mum-fluencers. We want to subsidize really bad ones. We want lots of people just being really bad at parenting on social media, and then we all feel terrific about ourselves. And then I think, Michelle, you had the courage to take a paper that involves positional externalities and actually say, let's tax the externality. And one of the things that's most striking to me is we economists have a long list of positional externalities. The only one which I'm aware of which there's been policy action on is doping in sports. In almost everything else, we just let it run. And these things, I think it's not very hard to think they're first order. So we allow my daughter to compete on fashion at school, whereas where I grew up, we all had school uniforms, which would be like a really good thing. We don't tax luxury goods enough. And the one I really want to suggest is every time Raj Chetty writes another paper, I feel worse about myself. And so if we could tax that guy, we could all be a lot happier.
Yun Chen?
I would like to offer my observation on yet another policy prescription, which is to ban private tutoring. In China, after the ban, actually these activities went underground. So students sneaked into their teachers' homes to get tutoring, trying not to be noticed by school supervisors or law enforcers. So soon after that, the government kind of realized instead of letting a parallel market forming, they had better legalize it. So they quietly lifted the ban, and now these private tutoring centers reemerged. They have always been there, actually. All I wanted to say is maybe if the scarcity of education resources and the resulting intense competition still exists, it is hard to, banning these private tutoring might not be a good solution or tactic.
Hubin?
I wonder if there's possible to have a opposite direction in the comparison term, because for example, if my child's human capital is the gap between my child's human capital and the benchmark is too high, that I give up comparing or reduce my investment. This is from my personal experience, because a lot of parents are doing so in China. The comparison is too intense. Yeah.
I've certainly stopped comparing myself to Daron. Penny.
Yes, I want to make 3 points. So first, we never discussed why higher fertility rates are considered desirable. As David said, there is no economic theory as to what the fertility rate should be relative to the replacement rate. This is already a very long discussion. I'm not sure we'll have time for that here. Second, as Michelle pointed out, not every country in the world has experienced this decline in fertility rates. And it seems to me we focus very much on the change, not on the level. But Korea, for example, which is a country that always features very prominently in this discussion, it used to be an extremely poor country until 4 decades ago. It had a higher fertility rate at that time. And then in the last 40 years, it grew very fast. And at the same time, the fertility rate went down. So it seems to me, when I look at the graph Michelle showed at the beginning, it seems all countries are converging approximately to similar birth rates. So maybe, given the structure of the labor market, it makes sense for couples to say, we'll have one child and we cannot afford more. So maybe there are some structural reasons regarding the level, not the change. And finally, I think this is a very provocative paper, and I think it intends to be. I take the message of the paper as being comparison motives should be incorporated in the discussion, as this is the only factor driving the decline in fertility rates. And anyone who has put kids through the college admissions process in the US will have a lot of sympathy for the rat race argument. But I'm also very sympathetic to the point David made that part of the reason we face this rat race is college admissions have become more equal, and kids who never had a chance of getting into Harvard or Yale, now they do have a chance. So we need to recognize that. I think part of the frustration reflects not frustration with the investments and the time parents spend managing kids, but the fact that a lot of these investments are considered totally wasteful. If we spend time helping our kids become better in writing, in reading, in math, in improving really important skills, or in being happier, I think most people would be very willing to do that. But there is a sense that you spend a lot of time doing meaningless things. And if that's the case, I think the right policy response would be to encourage colleges to change their college admissions criteria and not to tax education policy or tax human capital, which, for the reasons that were pointed out in the discussion, can have huge positive effects. It actually can be a race to the top, not a race to the bottom, as is now sometimes.
Reed?
Thanks. I just wanted to say that all this discussion has focused on trends in advanced economies, and yet there's still much more variation in fertility rates across countries by income. A stat which always surprises me is that in Mali, the urban fertility rate is 5.7 children per woman. And that was actually the cross-country comparison and levels was what motivated the Becker paper. And my sense is that that's still the leading explanation for those differences. Basically, one, that there's higher or lower returns to, or in higher income countries have higher returns to quality relative to quantity, and that also, I think, with decline of patriarchy, women can value their leisure more. And so for just everyone working on this topic, I'd encourage you to say, can your new theory explain both the cross-section and the trends in the high-income country? And if not, what's the difference?
Adele? Oh. Why don't we take... Oh, okay.
Okay, thanks. I think if we're talking about parenting decisions, we should also be talking about elder care. And in a lot of advanced economies, people are living longer and longer, and it certainly becomes important to your parenting experience whether you need to be also taking care of elderly parents. And it can be exceedingly expensive, enormously time-consuming, and could greatly affect how you feel about your career opportunities, but also the extent to which you're going to invest in more children or higher quality children.
Tatiana?
Okay, thanks. That was really interesting. So as people pointed out, there's a couple of other underlying models that could give rise to similar observed patterns. And in particular, I wonder if the right variable should be education or success in general. And I think that has important policy implications going forward, especially given the first paper with AI, because so far we've had skill bias, technological change, and greater inequality. And so it makes sense to have a rat race to get kids more educated. If AI, is relatively beneficial to lower skilled workers, I think maybe we might actually even see, if it is all about success, then it's less important to educate your kid to have them be successful. And I think we can maybe see even a fertility increase because it's less costly to raise a successful child.
Okay, let's bring it back to the authors.
Well, thank you very much for all these questions and comments. I guess that's a lot, so let me try to answer some of them and then also pass on to my co-authors. So one question that came up was, well, why do we, I think Penny said this, why do we need any policy at all? Why is it a goal to increase the birth rate? I couldn't agree more. I think that's precisely one of the reasons we wrote this paper. I think we need to understand what are the frictions and market failures that lead the birth rate to be wrong. Otherwise, we don't need to do anything. And our paper precisely offers one reason. There's a clear externality, and so with this particular comparison motive, it is below what's socially efficient and below what's optimal. But there are other reasons, obviously, and actually in the written paper, we discuss a bunch of the other reasons why the birth rate could be wrong and why there's a need for government intervention potentially. Then there were a lot of, I think, questions and comments on the concrete policy proposals, basically. So, yes, we completely agree. I mean, it's a difficult issue. Taxing education is a very provocative policy, obviously. So we're really trying to just shift the debate. We're saying a lot of the policy that's been implemented, trying to implement in many European countries, and maybe now also the US is sort of catching up, and in many European countries already for decades have been trying to stimulate the birth rate through so-called pronatal policies. And that's usually by giving money to parents, either free childcare or subsidized childcare or just literally tax breaks for giving children for giving birth. So we think maybe that is not the right or the only angle. So if our paper is right and part of the low birth rate is driven by the comparison motive, then we need other kinds of policies. And these were just some ideas on how we could get there. And obviously we need more of a debate and thinking to understand what are the right ones. In terms of the human capital, I think the best way to think about it, I realize it's not in this paper, but that maybe there are two types of human capital investments for the children. Some leading, or two types of education investments, some leading to truly better, improved human capital, but others are more for signaling purposes, like in the Spence signaling model. And so the signaling one, like maybe the athletic stuff, fits in there, but maybe also the music lessons, the piano and all of these things, which are often quite expensive, but also time intensive, because the parents either helping also with the practicing later on or driving the kids all over the place. So it's quite time intensive and monetary intensive. And maybe that itself doesn't really raise the human capital, but at the same time maybe helps them get into a college, because college, the admission process also puts some weight on this extracurricular activities often. But we agree. These are not the final policy proposals, obviously. There was some question, I think Melissa asked about this, and someone else made a comment on the childlessness. Which as an important margin of the low fertility is not just people choosing fewer kids, but also many children choosing not to have any kids. But I want to point out, our mechanism also works on the childlessness angle. In fact, our AER paper on the topic, we showed this very clearly. It happens for a range of parents that basically the aspired child quality, given the comparison motives, the quality they want for their children is so high that they end up choosing no children. Okay? So the same story, the same mechanism works also on the extensive margin. Then there were a bunch of alternative stories suggested, and I guess I can't comment on all of them, but elderly care obviously maybe also a reason for low fertility, because women or middle-aged people, they have to divide their time, and there were a bunch of other stories. And so obviously we're not saying this is the only reason why fertility is low. We're just putting another, I think, overlooked story on the table. And I guess Melissa was talking a lot about the shifting priorities. So I think we don't really disagree on that. So I see our story as one reason why the priorities are shifting. So let me maybe see if my co-authors want to add.
Okay, thank you very much for the excellent comments and all the questions. So let me try to add some points. So we think that the particular interpretation we put using this utility, this might be capturing persons' natural tendency to compare themselves to others, but this could be also a function of institutions like education system, right? For example, or labor market institutions. So, for example, in Korea, for example, education system is heavily based on relative performance. So, in school, for example, your kids, they get grade their ranking within the school, and this is very important for college admissions. So this naturally put people, parents, to put a lot of emphasis on relative performance. So we are thinking about this kind of nature, and so then naturally we think that the relative importance of this channel we propose can be very different across countries. So in Korea, this is universally relevant, but in the US, for example, this could be relevant only probably above median income distribution. So that's we acknowledge, also in the paper, I guess. And there was a question about this taxing a school at the coaches, right? So school coaches, I think in the U.S. this availability varies a lot by location, and location choice is essentially a parental investment choice in the U.S. So I guess this is in line with what we suggest, spending money is essentially location choice, which leads to this kind of things, right? And so college attendance rate in the U.S. is quite large. I think 60%, right? And also one thing we also present in the paper but not in the talk is Hispanics. we know from Melissa's recent paper that Hispanics experienced a fall in fertility. But if you look at college attendance rate, actually they experienced the largest increase in college attendance rate. So there might be some role of the social media in creating this comparison motive, and which affected this group particularly. So, but I mean, this is just suggestive. So, yeah, so that's something I wanted to say. And there were questions about the Korean context. So I do believe that in the economic growth context in Korea, there was a role of this education fever. But I think there's no clear answer which drove economic growth. And so it could be industrial policy or, but education played a role, that's for sure. Now, I think the question is like whether the thing that led to education is still ideal for the current situation with this intense competition, and which affects the parents' utility negatively because they allocate huge resources into kids, which leads to lower fertility as well. So this is something we are talking about. So perhaps the effect of this social comparison on growth, I mean, the importance of this is non-linear as a function of income. Right? You want to add something?
I'm just looking if I still have time to add one. Okay, maybe just to end the discussion on this note, I also want to thank a lot for this. So you mentioned the shifting priorities story, and that it could be partially about preferences. So maybe it's, I just want to leave you with this idea that if we actually ask prospective parents about their ideal family size and the number of children that they want to have, this is relatively stable at 2 or even higher. So this is in the US, but also in many other countries. So this signals to us that there's really a discrepancy between the desired fertility and the actual fertility, so there must be some kind of constraints that prospective parents are facing. Thank you.
And I wanted to add one point on, I think two people asked about whether, I think Steve Davis, you made this point, whether this is really relevant along the income distribution or just among sort of the people like us. And so I think so. So let me put 2 pieces of evidence on that. So there's some work by sociologists who are looking at parental aspirations, and they show this has gone up along the income distribution everywhere. It's just the ability to act on the aspirations is much harder, for example, for single moms. So they just don't have the time, the resources to actually, put a lot of this money and time in the children, but they're still facing the same pressure and then choosing to have fewer children also. That's the point by the sociologists. And then also, if you look at there has been a big increase in parental time with children. We know this from Melissa's work, for example, and that's also quite prevalent across the income distribution. This is not just driven sort of from the top. So that's why even if they don't go to college, we think, this kind of competition, maybe for the best apprenticeship or the best, even community college, or, there is some kind of competition for the, everywhere.
Yeah. Great. So let's thank the authors and the discussions.